Black boy sacrificed his lunch for an old couple. Next day, a millionaire knocked on his door. Jamal's stomach growled louder than his pride, but his eyes stayed fixed on the elderly woman counting pennies, unaware that his next decision would bring a millionaire to his door. Hello, family. Welcome to my channel. Before we begin, I have a small but heartfelt request. Please click that subscribe button. Like and share this story with someone who would to listen to this kind of uplifting story. Your support is what keeps these stories alive. Every time you click that button, you're helping us share voices that would otherwise be forgotten and stories that deserve to be heard. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and how this touched you. The fluorescent lights of Murphy's corner store buzzed overhead like dying insects, casting harsh shadows across the cracked linoleum floor. Jamal Washington stood in the narrow aisle between the chips and the canned goods, his worn sneakers silent against the sticky surface. His lunch money, 3 crumpled dollar bills and a handful of quarters, felt heavy in his pocket, heavier than it should for such a small amount. He'd been coming to Murphy's every day for 2 years, ever since Mom started working double shifts at the hospital. The routine never changed. Grab a sandwich, a bag of chips, maybe a juice box if he had enough left over. Today felt different, though he couldn't say why. The bell above the door chimed, and Jamal glanced up to see an elderly couple shuffle inside. The woman leaned heavily on a wooden cane, her gray hair pulled back in a neat bun despite the frayed edges of her coat. The man beside her moved with careful steps, his hand hovering protectively near her elbow. They looked like they dressed in their Sunday best, but the fabric was thin, worn soft by too many washings. Jamal watched them navigate the store with the deliberate movements of people who knew exactly what they could afford. The woman's fingers traced along the price tags, her lips moving silently as she calculated. They stopped in front of the deli counter, where pre-made sandwiches sat wrapped in plastic. "How much for the turkey sandwich, dear?" the woman asked Murphy, who barely looked up from his newspaper. $4.50, Murphy grunted. The woman's face fell slightly. She turned to her husband, and they had one of those wordless conversations that only couples married for decades could manage. Jamal saw the man's shoulders sag as he shook his head almost imperceptibly. "Maybe just the soup," the woman said, her voice carefully cheerful. "The small cup." $2.25, Murphy said, still not looking up. Across town, in a glass office that overlooked the city's skyline, David Kith stared at numbers that had lost all meaning. His computer screen displayed quarterly reports showing profits that would make most people dizzy, but the figures felt as cold as the marble floor beneath his Italian leather shoes. His assistant had left an hour ago, along with the rest of his staff. The building hummed with the quiet efficiency of after-hours cleaning crews and security guards, but David remained at his desk, surrounded by the trappings of success that felt increasingly hollow. A framed photo sat beside his monitor, his parents at their small restaurant 30 years ago, flour dusting his mother's apron, his father's proud smile as he held up their first dollar earned in America. David remembered being 8 years old, sitting at a corner table doing homework while the smell of dumplings filled the air and his parents worked 16-hour days to build something from nothing. When had he stopped feeling that pride? When had achievement become just another item to check off an endless list? His phone buzzed with a text from his driver. "Ready when you are, Mr. Kith." David looked out at the city lights beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk. Somewhere down there, people were going home to families, sharing meals, laughing over kitchen tables. He owned 3 houses and ate most of his dinners alone. Back at Murphy's, Jamal watched the elderly couple count their change twice, their fingers careful and deliberate. The woman's hand trembled slightly as she placed the coins on the counter, and Jamal noticed she was a quarter short. "I'm sorry," she said to Murphy, her cheeks flushing pink. "I thought I had enough." Murphy finally looked up, his expression impatient. $2.25 or no soup. The man reached into his pocket, searching for more change, but Jamal could see from his expression that there wasn't any. The woman's carefully maintained composure began to crack, and she started to turn away. "We'll come back tomorrow," she said quietly to her husband. Jamal's hand moved to his pocket before his brain caught up. His own lunch money felt like it was burning through the fabric. He thought about his empty stomach, about the long afternoon ahead with nothing to eat. He thought about his mother's tired face when she came home from her shifts, how she always asked if he'd eaten enough. But he also thought about the way the woman's shoulders had straightened when she'd walked into the store, how she'd maintained her dignity even as disappointment settled over her features. He thought about his grandmother, who used to say that kindness was the only currency that mattered. The couple was almost to the door when Jamal stepped forward. "Excuse me," he said, his voice quieter than he'd intended. They turned, and up close, Jamal could see the kindness in their eyes, the way they looked at him without judgment despite his second-hand clothes and worn backpack. "I was wondering," Jamal continued, his heart hammering against his ribs, "if you'd like to share lunch with me. Have you ever made a split-second decision that felt bigger than yourself, even when you couldn't explain why? Share with us your experience in the comments below." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge Jamal wasn't sure he was brave enough to cross. The elderly woman's eyes widened, and her husband's hand tightened protectively on her arm. "Oh, sweetheart," the woman said, her voice soft with surprise. "That's very kind, but we couldn't." "Please," Jamal interrupted, then caught himself. His grandmother had taught him better manners than that. "I mean, I'd really like the company. I usually eat alone." It wasn't entirely true. He often sat with friends in the school cafeteria, but something about these two made him want to offer more than just charity. He wanted to offer connection. The woman looked at her husband, and again they had one of those silent conversations. Jamal could see the war between pride and hunger playing out across their faces. He understood that war intimately. "What's your name, young man?" the husband asked, his voice carrying the careful dignity of someone who'd learned to navigate the world with grace despite its hardships. "Jamal. Jamal Washington." "I'm Rose," the woman said, "and this is my husband, Frank. We've been married 43 years next month." "Congratulations," Jamal said, and meant it. He'd never known his father, and watching his mother work so hard just to keep them afloat had made him wonder if love like that was even possible anymore. Frank studied Jamal's face with the intensity of someone who'd learned to read people out of necessity. "You sure about this, son? Lunch money's important when you're young." Jamal thought about lying, about pretending he had more than he did. Instead, he found himself telling the truth. "It is important, but so is this." He wasn't even sure what this was. The moment, the connection, the feeling that something significant was happening in the fluorescent-lit corner store that smelled like old coffee and floor wax. Rose's eyes filled with tears she was too proud to let fall. "Frank, I think we should accept this young man's invitation." Murphy watched the exchange with the bored expression of someone who'd seen every kind of human drama play out in his store. "You buying something or not? I got other customers." Jamal looked around the empty store, then back at Murphy. "Yes, sir. We'd like 3 turkey sandwiches, 3 bags of chips, and 3 juice boxes." His mental math told him he was about $4 short, but he pulled out his money anyway. $3.75. He stared at the bills and coins in his palm, feeling heat creep up his neck. "I can cover the rest," Frank said quietly, reaching for his wallet. "No," Jamal said, more firmly than he'd intended. "I invited you. This is on me." He looked up at Murphy, who was watching with something that might have been interest. "Could I maybe work off the difference? Sweep up or something?" Murphy's expression shifted, and for a moment, Jamal saw something almost like respect flicker across his features. "Tell you what, kid. You come back tomorrow after school, help me unload a delivery truck, and we'll call it even." "Deal," Jamal said immediately. As Murphy prepared their sandwiches, Rose touched Jamal's arm gently. "You know, Jamal, when I was your age, my family didn't have much either. But my mother always said that sharing what little you have makes it somehow more than it was before." "My grandmother used to say something like that too," Jamal replied. "She said kindness multiplies." Frank nodded approvingly. Smart women, both of them. They found a small table near the window, where afternoon sunlight streamed through glass that had seen better days. As they unwrapped their sandwiches, Jamal noticed how Rose and Frank waited for him to take the first bite, a small courtesy that made his chest tight with emotion. "So what do you want to be when you grow up, Jamal?" Rose asked, her sandwich barely touched as she focused on him with the kind of attention that made him feel important. "I want to be a teacher," he said, surprising himself. He'd never said it out loud before. "Maybe teach little kids. Help them learn to read." "That's wonderful," Frank said. "The world needs more teachers like you'll be." "Like I'll be. Someone who sees when people need help," Rose explained. "Someone who acts on it." They ate slowly, making the meal last. Rose told him about the library where she used to work before her arthritis got too bad. Frank shared stories about his days as a bus driver, how he'd learned every regular passenger's name and story. Jamal found himself talking about his mother, about school, about dreams he'd never shared with anyone. As they finished eating, Rose reached across the table and covered Jamal's hand with her own. Her skin was soft and warm, marked with age spots and the thin scars of a life fully lived. "Thank you," she said simply. "Not just for the food. For seeing us." Jamal didn't understand what she meant, not entirely, but he felt the weight of it. In a world that often looked right through people like him, like them, being seen felt like the most precious gift imaginable. As they prepared to leave, Frank pressed something into Jamal's hand. "Our address," he said. "In case you ever need anything. Anything at all." Jamal looked down at the carefully written address on a piece of paper torn from a small notebook. "Thank you, but I'm okay." "I know you are," Frank said. "But sometimes okay people need help too." They parted ways outside Murphy's, Rose and Frank walking slowly down the sidewalk, their steps somehow lighter than when they'd arrived. Jamal watched them go, his stomach empty but his heart strangely full. He had no way of knowing that 3 blocks away, David Kith sat in the back of his car, stuck in traffic, watching the same elderly couple through his tinted window and wondering what had put such peaceful smiles on their faces. The next morning arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of weather that made everything feel muted and uncertain. Jamal sat at his kitchen table, staring at the piece of paper Frank had given him. The address was written in careful script, the kind his grandmother used to use for important things. His mother, Patricia, moved around the small kitchen with the efficient grace of someone who'd learned to do everything quickly. Her scrubs were already wrinkled from her overnight shift, and dark circles shadowed her eyes. "You're quiet this morning," she said, pouring coffee into a travel mug. "Everything okay at school?" Jamal folded the paper and slipped it into his backpack. "Yeah, Mom. Everything's fine." It wasn't a lie, exactly. School was fine. It was everything else that felt complicated. He'd barely slept, replaying yesterday's lunch over and over in his mind. The way Rose's hand had trembled when she'd counted her change. The dignity in Frank's voice when he'd offered to pay. The strange lightness Jamal had felt walking home with an empty stomach but a full heart. "I might be a little late today," Patricia said, kissing the top of his head. "Double shift again. There's leftover pizza in the fridge for dinner." After she left, Jamal sat in the quiet apartment, listening to the rain tap against the windows. He thought about Rose and Frank, wondered if they were warm enough in whatever place they called home. The thought made his chest tight with worry he couldn't quite name. At school, he found it impossible to concentrate. During lunch, he sat with his usual group of friends, picking at the cafeteria's version of pizza while they talked about video games and weekend plans. Their conversations felt distant, like he was hearing them through water. "You okay, Jay?" his friend Marcus asked. "You're being weird." "I'm fine," Jamal said automatically, then caught himself. He'd used that word too much lately. Fine. Like it was a shield against having to explain things that felt too big for words. Just thinking about stuff. What kind of stuff? Jamal almost told him about yesterday, about Rose and Frank, and the way sharing his lunch had felt like the most important thing he'd ever done. But looking around the table at his friends, good kids, but kids who'd never had to count change for a meal, he realized they wouldn't understand. "Nothing important," he said instead. Meanwhile, across the city, David Kith sat in his office trying to focus on a merger proposal that would net his company millions. The numbers swam before his eyes, meaningless as hieroglyphs. He'd been distracted all morning, his mind returning again and again to the elderly couple he'd glimpsed from his car window the day before. There had been something about them, the way they'd walked together, the peaceful expressions on their faces, that had lodged itself in his consciousness like a splinter. In a world where David was surrounded by people who wanted something from him, their simple contentment had seemed almost foreign. His assistant knocked and entered without waiting for permission, a habit that usually annoyed him but today barely registered. "Mr. Kith? The Morrison Group is here for the 3 o'clock. David glanced at his watch. Somehow it was already 2:45. "Send them in." But as the executives filed into his conference room, their expensive suits and practiced smiles blurring together, David found himself thinking about authenticity. When was the last time he'd had a genuine conversation with someone who didn't want anything from him? When was the last time he'd done something simply because it felt right? The meeting dragged on, full of corporate speak and strategic positioning. David nodded at appropriate intervals, signed where he was supposed to sign, but his heart wasn't in it. As the executives shook hands and exchanged business cards, David felt the familiar emptiness settling over him like a heavy coat. After they left, he stood at his office window, looking down at the street below. Somewhere in this city, real life was happening. People were connecting, helping each other, finding meaning in small moments. And here he was, 43 floors above it all, isolated by his own success. His phone buzzed with a text from his mother. "Haven't heard from you in weeks. Are you eating enough?" The question hit him harder than it should have. When was the last time someone had asked if he was eating enough? When was the last time anyone had worried about his basic needs rather than his quarterly projections? He started to type back his usual response. "I'm fine, Mom. Just busy," but stopped. That word again. Fine. The universal deflection. Instead, he found himself walking to the elevator, past his confused assistant, down to the parking garage where his driver waited. "Where to, Mr. Kith?" David hesitated. He had no destination in mind, just a restless need to be somewhere else, anywhere else. "Just drive," he said. "Downtown. The older neighborhoods." As the car pulled into traffic, David watched the city change outside his window. The gleaming towers of the financial district gave way to smaller buildings, family-owned shops, places where people actually lived rather than just worked. Back at Jefferson Middle School, Jamal was having his own crisis of direction. The final bell had rung, and he stood at his locker, staring at the piece of paper with Rose and Frank's address. Part of him wanted to walk by their street, just to make sure they were okay. Another part of him, the practical part that sounded like his mother, told him to mind his own business. He'd done his good deed. He'd shared his lunch, felt good about it, and that should be enough. Getting more involved would be complicated. What if they expected things from him he couldn't provide? What if they thought he was just some kid playing at being helpful? "You coming to basketball practice?" Marcus called from down the hall. Jamal looked at his friend, then at the address in his hand. "I can't today. I have something I need to do." "Like what?" "Just something." Marcus shrugged and jogged off toward the gym. Jamal folded the paper carefully and put it back in his backpack. He'd go home, do his homework, help his mother when she got back from her shift. Normal things. Safe things. But as he walked toward the school exit, he found his feet carrying him in a different direction. Not toward home, but toward the bus stop that would take him across town to the address written in Frank's careful handwriting. He told himself he was just curious. That he'd walk by, maybe see if they were okay, then go home. Nothing more complicated than that. The bus ride took 20 minutes, carrying him through neighborhoods that grew progressively older and more worn. The houses here were small but well-maintained, with tiny front yards and porches where people actually sat. It felt like a different world from the apartment complex where he lived with his mother. He found their street easily enough. Maple Avenue, lined with oak trees that had probably been there for decades. The houses were modest but dignified, the kind of place where people knew their neighbors' names. Number 247 was a small blue house with white trim and a front porch that sagged slightly on one side. The yard was neat despite being mostly dirt, and someone had planted flowers in coffee cans along the walkway. Jamal stood across the street, suddenly unsure why he'd come. What was he supposed to do now? Knock on the door. What would he say? As he hesitated, the front door opened, and Rose appeared, moving slowly down the porch steps with her cane. She was heading toward an old mailbox at the end of the walkway, and Jamal could see her struggling with the distance. Before he could think about it, he was crossing the street. Mrs. Rose. She turned, and her face lit up with genuine surprise and pleasure. Jamal! What a wonderful surprise! What brings you to our neighborhood? He felt heat creep up his neck. I wanted to make sure you and Mr. Frank were okay. Oh, sweetheart. Her voice was soft with understanding. You were worried about us. It wasn't a question, and Jamal found himself nodding. A little bit. Well, come inside then. Frank will be so happy to see you. And I just made some tea. As she led him toward the house, Jamal felt that same strange lightness he'd experienced yesterday. Like he was exactly where he was supposed to be, even if he couldn't explain why. The inside of Rose and Frank's house was like stepping into a warm embrace. The furniture was old but lovingly maintained, and every surface held small treasures. Photographs, books with worn spines, a collection of ceramic birds on the mantelpiece. The air smelled like lavender and something baking. Frank! Rose called toward the back of the house. We have a visitor. Frank appeared from what looked like a small kitchen, wiping his hands on a dish towel. His face broke into a genuine smile when he saw Jamal. Well, I'll be. Jamal, right? What brings you by, son? Jamal shifted his backpack, suddenly feeling foolish. I just wanted to check on you both. Make sure yesterday didn't. I hope I didn't make you uncomfortable or anything. Rose and Frank exchanged one of their wordless looks, and Jamal saw something pass between them that looked like understanding mixed with gentle amusement. Uncomfortable. Rose laughed, a sound like wind chimes. Oh, honey, yesterday was the best day we've had in months. Wasn't it, Frank? Absolutely, Frank agreed. Haven't stopped talking about it. About you. Me. Sit down, sweetheart, Rose said, guiding him to a worn but comfortable armchair. Let me get you some tea. Or would you prefer juice? Tea's fine, thank you. As Rose moved carefully toward the kitchen, Frank settled into the chair across from Jamal. You know, in 43 years of marriage, Rose and I have met a lot of people. But it's rare to encounter someone your age with such awareness. Awareness. Of other people. Of need. Most folks your age are wrapped up in their own worlds, which is natural enough. But you saw us. Really saw us. Jamal felt uncomfortable with the praise. You looked hungry. We were hungry, Frank said simply. But more than that, we were invisible. Do you know what that feels like, son? To move through the world like you're not really there. Jamal thought about walking through school hallways, about sitting in classes where teachers looked right through him, about the way some store clerks watched him like he might steal something. Yeah, he said quietly. I think I do. Rose returned with a tray holding 3 mismatched cups and a plate of cookies that looked homemade. As she poured the tea, Jamal noticed her hands shaking slightly. Are you okay, Mrs. Rose? Oh, I'm fine, dear. Just a little tired. I had a doctor's appointment this morning, and those always wear me out. Frank's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Everything okay with the appointment? Of course, Rose said, but something in her voice suggested otherwise. Just routine. An awkward silence settled over the room. Jamal sipped his tea. It was chamomile, sweet and soothing, and tried to think of something to say. The cookies were still warm, clearly made from scratch, and they tasted like his grandmother's used to. "These are amazing," he said, and Rose's face brightened. "My mother's recipe. I don't get to bake much anymore, but having company seemed like a good excuse." "You made these for me?" "Well, Frank and I don't need a whole batch. It's nice to have someone to share them with." As they talked, Jamal learned more about their life together. Frank had driven city buses for 37 years before retiring. Rose had worked at the public library, helping people find books and teaching children to read. They'd never had children of their own, something Rose mentioned with a wistfulness that made Jamal's chest tight. "We always said we'd travel when Frank retired," Rose said, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. "See the ocean, maybe visit those national parks we always read about." "What happened?" Jamal asked, then immediately worried he'd been too personal. Frank and Rose exchanged another look. "Life happened," Frank said gently. "Rose got sick a few years back. Medical bills, you know. Had to make choices. But we're rich in other ways," Rose added quickly, reaching over to squeeze Frank's hand. "We have each other. We have this house. We have new friends who share their lunch with strangers." The way she said it made Jamal feel like he'd given them something precious, when really all he'd done was buy sandwiches. Outside, the afternoon was growing darker, and Jamal realized he'd been there for over an hour. His mother would be getting home soon, and he still had homework to do. "I should probably go," he said reluctantly. "Of course, dear. But you'll come back, won't you?" Rose's voice held a note of hope that made it impossible to say no. "If you want me to." "We'd love that," Frank said. "More than you know." As Jamal gathered his backpack, Rose disappeared into the kitchen and returned with a small container. "Cookies for your mother," she explained. "And for you, for later." "Mrs. Rose, you don't have to." "I want to," she said firmly. "It makes me happy to have someone to bake for again." Frank walked him to the door. "Jamal, can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Yesterday, when you offered to share your lunch with us, had you ever done anything like that before?" Jamal thought about it. "Not exactly like that, no." "What made you do it?" It was a question Jamal had been asking himself since yesterday. "I don't know," he said honestly. "It just felt like the right thing to do." Frank nodded slowly. "Sometimes the right thing chooses us, doesn't it? Instead of the other way around." As Jamal walked toward the bus stop, he turned back to see Rose and Frank standing on their porch, waving. The image stayed with him during the ride home. Two people who had so little but somehow made him feel like he'd been given a gift just by spending time with them. He didn't know that 6 blocks away, David Kith's car was stuck in traffic, and that David was staring out his window at the same bus Jamal was riding, wondering what it would feel like to be going somewhere that mattered. What happens when we discover that the people we think we understand are carrying stories we never imagined? 3 days later, Jamal found himself back on Rose and Frank's porch, this time carrying his math homework. Rose had mentioned that Frank used to help neighborhood kids with their studies back when he was driving buses, and Jamal was struggling with algebra. Come in," Rose said, her voice bright but strained. "Frank's in the living room. He's been looking forward to this all day." But when Jamal entered the living room, he found Frank sitting in his chair with a shoebox open on his lap, photographs scattered around him like fallen leaves. The older man looked up with eyes that seemed older than they had just days before. "Oh, Jamal. I didn't hear you come in. I can come back later if you're busy." No. Sit down, son. I was just remembering." Rose appeared with her usual tray of tea, but Jamal noticed her movements were more careful today, more deliberate. She settled into her chair with a small sigh that she tried to hide. "Frank was telling me about his childhood," she said, though something in her tone suggested there was more to the story. Frank picked up one of the photographs. a black and white image of a young Asian boy standing next to a woman in an apron. This is me with my mother, outside our first restaurant in Chinatown. I was about your age, Jamal. Jamal studied the photo. The boy in the picture looked serious, older than his years, standing with a kind of posture that suggested he'd learned responsibility early. We came here with nothing, Frank continued. My parents, they worked 18-hour days trying to build something. I spent most of my childhood in that restaurant, doing homework at corner tables, helping serve customers when I was tall enough to reach the counter. That must have been hard, Jamal said. It was. But it was also purposeful. Every day, we were building towards something better. Frank's voice grew distant. My parents had such dreams for me. College, a profession, a life easier than theirs. Rose reached over and touched Frank's hand gently. Tell him about David. Frank's expression shifted, and Jamal saw pain flicker across his features. David was my son. Not by blood, but by choice. A boy from the neighborhood whose parents worked even longer hours than mine. He used to come to the restaurant after school, and my mother would feed him, help him with homework. What happened to him? Jamal asked, though he sensed the answer would be difficult. He grew up, Frank said simply. Got everything my parents dreamed of for me. College, success, more money than any of us could have imagined. But somewhere along the way, Frank trailed off, staring at the photograph. He forgot where he came from, Rose finished gently. Forgot the people who helped him get there. Frank nodded. I haven't seen David in 15 years. He sends a Christmas card every year, always signed by his assistant. Never a phone call, never a visit. It's like we stopped existing once he didn't need us anymore. The pain in Frank's voice was raw, unguarded. Jamal felt like he was witnessing something private, sacred in its honesty. I'm sorry, Jamal said, because he didn't know what else to say. The thing is, Frank continued, I don't blame him. Success can be isolating. The higher you climb, the smaller everything below you looks. I wonder sometimes if he's happy. If all that success was worth losing the connections that made him who he was. Rose shifted in her chair, and Jamal caught a glimpse of something she was trying to hide, a medical bracelet on her wrist, the kind people wore for serious conditions. Mrs. Rose, are you feeling okay? She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. I'm fine, sweetheart. Just a little tired. Frank's expression tightened. Rose, maybe we should tell him. Tell me what? Rose and Frank had another of their silent conversations, this one longer and more intense than usual. Finally, Rose sighed. I have cancer, Jamal. Pancreatic. The doctors say. She paused, gathering herself. They say I have maybe 6 months. The words hit Jamal like a physical blow. But you seem fine. You're baking cookies, making tea. I am fine, Rose said firmly. For now. And I intend to stay fine for as long as possible. But Frank and we're facing some difficult decisions. What kind of decisions? Frank cleared his throat. The treatments are expensive. Even with Medicare, the costs are substantial. We might have to sell the house. Jamal looked around the living room, at the photographs, the ceramic birds, the worn furniture that held decades of memories. This is your home. Yes, Rose said simply. It is. But it's also just a place. Home is wherever Frank and I are together. But where would you go? There's a facility across town, Frank said. It's not bad, as those places go. We could get a small apartment, share the costs. You mean like a nursing home? Assisted living, Rose corrected gently. It would be practical. Jamal felt anger rising in his chest, though he couldn't say exactly why. It seemed wrong, fundamentally unfair, that people like Rose and Frank, People who had spent their lives helping others, who had raised a boy who wasn't even their own son, should have to give up their home, their independence, their dignity. "What about David?" he asked. "Couldn't he help?" Frank's laugh was bitter. "David doesn't even know Rose is sick. And even if he did," he shrugged, "we're not his responsibility anymore. We haven't been for a long time." "But he should know," Jamal said, surprising himself with his vehemence. "He should know what's happening to you." "Should and will are different things, son," Frank said sadly. "Some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt." As Jamal walked home that evening, his algebra homework forgotten, he carried the weight of Rose and Frank's story like a stone in his chest. The unfairness of it consumed him, that two people who had given so much could be facing their final months alone, forgotten by the person they'd helped raise, forced to abandon the home they'd built together. But more than anger, he felt a desperate need to do something. The problem was, he had no idea what a 14-year-old kid with $3 in his pocket could possibly do to help. That night, he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about David Kith, a name Frank had mentioned with such pain. Somewhere in this city was a man who had everything but had lost the people who mattered most. A man who didn't even know that the woman who had fed him after school, who had helped him with homework at a corner table in a Chinese restaurant, was dying. Jamal thought about his own mother, working double shifts to keep them afloat. He thought about the sacrifices she made, the way she never complained even when she was exhausted. What would he do if someone who had helped shape his life simply disappeared from it? What would he do if he had the power to help but didn't know they needed it? The questions followed him into restless sleep, where he dreamed of empty houses and forgotten photographs, of bridges burning while people stood on opposite sides, too proud or too hurt to call out to each other. The next afternoon, Jamal found himself at Rose and Frank's house again, but this time he came with a purpose beyond homework or social visits. He'd spent the morning at the library, researching pancreatic cancer, treatment options, and costs. The information he'd found had only deepened his resolve to help somehow. Rose answered the door wearing a bright yellow sweater that made her look more fragile than usual, but her smile was genuine. "2 days in a row," she said warmly. "We're spoiling you, aren't we, Frank?" "Or he's spoiling us," Frank replied from his chair. "Either way, I'm not complaining." Jamal settled into what had become his usual spot, but instead of pulling out homework, he sat forward with the intensity of someone who'd made a decision. "I want to help," he said without preamble. Rose and Frank exchanged glances. "Help with what, sweetheart?" "With everything. The medical bills, keeping your house, finding David." The words tumbled out faster than he'd intended. "I know I'm just a kid, and I don't have money or connections or anything useful, but there has to be something I can do." Frank's expression softened. "Jamal, that's incredibly kind, but—" "No, listen," Jamal interrupted, then caught himself. "Sorry. I mean, please listen. I've been thinking about this all night. You helped raise David, right? You fed him, helped him with homework, treated him like family." "Yes," Rose said quietly. "And now he's successful, really successful, but he doesn't know you need help?" "That's right. Then maybe the problem isn't that he doesn't care. Maybe the problem is that he doesn't know." Frank shook his head slowly. "Son, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but David made his choice a long time ago. He has our address, our phone number. If he wanted to be in touch. But what if he's scared?" Jamal pressed. "What if he thinks you don't want to hear from him? What if he's been waiting for you to reach out too?" Rose leaned forward, her eyes bright with interest. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting we find him. We tell him what's happening. We give him a chance to be the person you helped him become." "And if he says no?" Frank asked. "If he's too busy or too important or just doesn't care anymore?" Jamal met his eyes steadily. "Then at least we'll know. And at least he'll know that you never stopped caring about him." The room fell silent except for the ticking of an old clock on the mantelpiece. Rose reached for Frank's hand, and Jamal could see them having another of their wordless conversations. "How would we even find him?" Rose asked finally. "I already did," Jamal said, pulling a piece of paper from his backpack. "David Kith, CEO of Chen Holdings. His company has offices downtown. I found articles about him online, pictures from charity events, even an interview where he talks about growing up in his parents' restaurant." Frank took the paper with trembling hands. "This is really him? Look at the picture." Frank studied the photograph, a professional headshot of a man in an expensive suit, but Jamal could see recognition dawning in the older man's eyes. "It's him," Frank whispered. "Older, but it's definitely him." "He looks successful," Rose observed. "He looks lonely," Frank said, and something in his voice suggested he understood loneliness intimately. "So what do we do?" Jamal asked. Rose stood up slowly, moving to a small desk in the corner of the room. She pulled out a piece of stationery, cream-colored paper with roses printed along the border, and sat down with a pen. "We write him a letter," she said simply. "A letter." Jamal had been thinking more along the lines of showing up at David's office, making a dramatic appeal. "Sometimes the old ways are the best ways," Frank said. "A letter gives him time to think, to decide how he wants to respond. No pressure, no ambush." Rose began writing, her handwriting careful and deliberate. As she worked, she read aloud. "Dear David, I hope this letter finds you well and happy. Frank and I often think of you and wonder how life has treated you. We're so proud of everything you've accomplished." She paused, looking up at Frank. "What should I say about the cancer?" "The truth," Frank said gently. "But gently." Rose continued writing, and Jamal watched her craft each sentence with the care of someone who understood that words could heal or wound, connect or divide. She wrote about their memories of David as a boy, about watching him grow into a man they were proud to have known. She mentioned her illness almost casually, as if it were just another piece of news to share. "Should I ask him to visit?" she asked. "No," Frank said. "Just let him know we're here. Let him decide what he wants to do with that information." When Rose finished, she read the letter aloud. It was perfect, warm without being manipulative, honest without being dramatic, loving without being demanding. "Now what?" Jamal asked. "Now we mail it," Rose said, "and we wait. What if he doesn't respond?" Frank smiled, and for the first time since Jamal had known him, it was a smile without sadness. "Then we'll know we tried. And sometimes, trying is enough." As they walked to the mailbox together, Rose leaning on Frank's arm, Jamal carrying the letter, Jamal felt something shift in the air around them. It wasn't hope exactly, but it was possibility. The chance that bridges could be rebuilt, that love could survive years of silence, that sometimes the right words could find their way to the right person at exactly the right time. Rose dropped the letter into the mailbox with a soft thud that seemed to echo with promise. "Now we wait," she said again, but this time her voice carried something it hadn't before: faith. The letter had been in the mail for 5 days when everything fell apart. Jamal was at Rose and Frank's house, helping Frank organize old photographs while Rose napped in her bedroom. The cancer treatments had started, and they left her exhausted in ways that sleep couldn't quite fix. Frank moved around the house like he was walking on eggshells, trying to maintain normalcy while watching the woman he loved fade a little more each day. "This one's from David's high school graduation," Frank said, holding up a photograph of a young Asian man in cap and gown, flanked by Frank and Rose. They all looked so young, so hopeful. "He was valedictorian, you know. Full scholarship to Stanford." "You must have been proud," Jamal said. "We were." Rose cried through the whole ceremony. Frank's voice was soft with memory. David gave a speech about the importance of community, about how success means nothing if you don't lift others up with you. The irony hung in the air between them, unspoken but heavy. The phone rang, startling them both. Frank answered with the careful politeness of someone who'd learned to expect bad news. "Hello." "Yes, This is Frank Kith. A pause. I'm sorry, who is this? Jamal watched Frank's face change, saw hope flicker and then die in his eyes. I see. Yes, I understand. Thank you for calling. Frank hung up the phone and stood there for a long moment, his hand still resting on the receiver. Who was that? Jamal asked, though he already suspected. David's assistant. She said Mr. Kith received our letter and wanted her to call and thank us for thinking of him. She said he's very busy with an important merger right now, but he appreciates us reaching out. The words hit Jamal like physical blows. That's it? That's all he said. She also said that if we need financial assistance, there are several excellent social service agencies that might be able to help. She's going to mail us some brochures. Frank's voice was carefully neutral, but Jamal could see the devastation in his posture, the way his shoulders curved inward as if protecting himself from further hurt. He didn't even call himself, Jamal said, anger rising in his chest. He had his assistant do it. It's fine, Frank said, but his voice cracked on the words. We tried. That's what matters. It's not fine. Jamal exploded, surprising himself with his vehemence. It's not fine at all. You raised him. You fed him, helped him with homework, treated him like your own son, and he can't even pick up the phone himself. Jamal. No. This is wrong. Mrs. Rose is dying, and he's worried about some stupid merger? What kind of person does that? Frank sank into his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 78 years. The kind of person who's forgotten where he came from. The kind of person I was afraid he'd become. From the bedroom came the sound of Rose stirring, and Frank immediately composed himself, smoothing his expression into something resembling calm. She doesn't need to know about this right now, he said quietly. She's got enough to worry about. But Rose appeared in the doorway, moving slowly but with determination. Know about what? Frank and Jamal exchanged glances. Rose might be sick, but she wasn't fragile, and she deserved the truth. David's assistant called, Frank said gently. He got our letter. Rose's face lit up with hope. And the silence stretched between them like a chasm. Rose's expression slowly changed as she read the truth in their faces. I see, she said finally, her voice small. Rose. No, it's all right. She moved to her chair with careful dignity. I suppose I knew this might happen. People change. Life moves on. But Jamal could see the tears she was fighting, the way her hands trembled as she smoothed her skirt. This woman who had spent her life helping others, who was facing her final months with such grace, deserved better than a phone call from an assistant and a promise of social service brochures. I'm going to find him, Jamal said suddenly. What? Frank looked alarmed. I'm going to his office. I'm going to make him listen. Jamal. No. You can't just. Why not? What's the worst that could happen? He has security throw me out? At least I'll have tried. Rose reached for his hand. Sweetheart, that's very sweet, but nothing. Jamal pulled away, pacing the small living room like a caged animal. This is wrong. You're good people, the best people I've ever met, and you're suffering while he sits in some fancy office counting his money. Life isn't fair, son, Frank said sadly. The sooner you learn that. No. Jamal's voice cracked with emotion. Maybe life isn't fair, but that doesn't mean we stop trying to make it better. That doesn't mean we just give up. He was crying now, tears of frustration and rage and helplessness streaming down his face. You shared your lunch with me when you barely had enough for yourselves. You welcomed me into your home, treated me like family. You deserve better than this. Rose stood up slowly and pulled Jamal into a hug. He was taller than her now, but in her arms, he felt like a child again. Oh, sweetheart, she whispered. You have such a good heart. But some things can't be fixed, no matter how much we want them to be. But I have to try, Jamal said into her shoulder. I have to do something. I know, Rose said, stroking his hair. I know you do. But sometimes the bravest thing is knowing when to let go. As Jamal walked home that evening, his heart felt like it was breaking. For Rose, facing her final months without the support she deserved. For Frank, watching his wife suffer while the son he'd helped raise turned his back on them. And for himself, because he was learning that caring about people meant sometimes watching them hurt and being powerless to stop it. The world felt darker than it had before he'd met Rose and Frank. But somehow, despite everything, he knew he wouldn't trade knowing them for the innocence he'd lost. David Kith sat in his corner office at 11:47 p.m., staring at a letter that had been sitting on his desk for 3 days. The merger documents that should have had his full attention lay forgotten beside it, their importance suddenly diminished by the careful handwriting on cream-colored paper with roses along the border. His assistant had handled the phone call, just as he'd instructed. Clean, professional, distant. The way he handled everything these days. But the letter remained, and with it, memories he'd spent 15 years trying to bury. Dear David, I hope this letter finds you well and happy. Rose's words echoed in his mind, each sentence a small knife turning in his chest. She wrote about his childhood as if it had been precious to her, as if those afternoons in his parents' restaurant had meant as much to her as they had to him. She mentioned her cancer almost casually, the way she might mention the weather, but David could read between the lines. Rose was dying, and she'd reached out to him. Not for money, not for favors, but simply to let him know. And he'd had his assistant call them back. David stood and walked to his window, looking down at the city lights that had once seemed like stars he could reach. When had he become the kind of person who couldn't pick up a phone to call the woman who had taught him to read? When had success become more important than the people who had helped him achieve it? His reflection stared back at him from the dark glass. Expensive suit, perfect haircut, the kind of polished appearance that opened doors and commanded respect. But behind his own eyes, he saw something that made him look away, the face of a man who had gained everything and lost himself in the process. The letter mentioned Frank too, how proud they both were of David's accomplishments. But David remembered Frank's last phone call, 15 years ago, asking if David might visit for Rose's birthday. David had been in the middle of a crucial negotiation, and he'd promised to call back. He never had. How many birthdays had he missed? How many holidays, anniversaries, ordinary Tuesday evenings when they might have shared a meal and talked about life? How many chances to be the man they'd helped him become instead of the stranger he'd chosen to be? His phone buzzed with a text from his driver. Still waiting, Mr. Kith. Should I head home? David looked at the clock. Nearly midnight. His driver had been waiting for 3 hours while David sat paralyzed by a letter from his past. This was his life now. People waiting for him, schedules to keep, obligations that felt increasingly meaningless. He thought about Rose and Frank in their small blue house, probably asleep by now. Frank would be lying awake, listening to Rose breathe, counting each breath like a prayer. And David was here, surrounded by luxury, utterly alone. His mother's voice echoed in his memory. Success without compassion is just expensive loneliness. She'd said that to him once years ago, when he'd missed his father's birthday for a business dinner. He'd dismissed it then as old-fashioned sentiment. Now it felt like prophecy. David picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found a number he hadn't called in years. His finger hovered over it for a long moment before he pressed dial. Mom! His voice cracked slightly. I know it's late, but I need to ask you something. Meanwhile, across the city, Jamal lay in his narrow bed, staring at the ceiling and wrestling with his own impossible choices. He'd promised his mother he'd stay out of trouble, focus on school, not get involved in things that weren't his business. But how could he go to school tomorrow knowing that Rose and Frank were facing their crisis alone? He thought about David Kith in his glass tower, probably sleeping peacefully while the people who'd helped raise him suffered. The injustice of it burned in his chest like acid. His mother's soft breathing came from the next room, and Jamal thought about waking her, telling her everything. But Patricia worked so hard just to keep them afloat. She didn't need the weight of his problems, too. At 2 a.m., Jamal made his decision. He would skip school tomorrow and go to David Kith's office. He would find a way to get past security, past assistance, past all the barriers that money and success could build. He would make David Kith look him in the eye and explain how he could turn his back on the people who had loved him. It was a terrible plan, probably doomed to failure, but it was the only plan he had. Jamal had just drifted off to sleep when his phone rang. The sound jolted him awake, and he fumbled for it in the darkness, worried something had happened to his mother. "Hello," he whispered. "Is this Jamal Washington?" The voice was unfamiliar, male, with a slight accent. "Who is this?" "My name is David Kith. I believe you know Frank and Rose." Jamal sat up so quickly he nearly fell out of bed. "Mr. Kith, I got your number from Frank. I hope you don't mind me calling so late, but I needed to talk to someone who knows them. Someone who can tell me how they really are." "How they really are?" Jamal's voice rose with indignation. "They're scared and alone, and Mrs. Rose is dying while you're too busy with your merger to even call them yourself." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When David spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. "You're right. You're absolutely right, and I have no excuse for that. None at all." The admission took the wind out of Jamal's anger. "Then why did you do it?" "Because I'm a coward," David said simply. "Because I was afraid that if I called them myself, I'd have to face what I've become. What I've lost. What you've lost. My family. The only real family I ever had. I told myself I was too busy, too important, that they wouldn't want to hear from me anyway. But the truth is, I was ashamed. Ashamed that I'd become exactly the kind of person they taught me not to be." Jamal found himself gripping the phone tighter. "They still love you. Even after everything, they still talk about you like you're their son." David's breath caught audibly. "They do. Mr. Frank keeps pictures of you. Mrs. Rose made cookies the other day and said she wished she had someone to bake for. They never stopped caring about you, even when you stopped caring about them." "I never stopped caring," David said quietly. "I just stopped showing it. And now Rose is sick, and I've wasted 15 years being too proud to pick up a phone. So what are you going to do about it?" Another long pause. "I don't know. What would you do?" The question surprised Jamal. Here was one of the most successful men in the city, asking a 14-year-old boy for advice. "I'd go see them," Jamal said without hesitation. "Tonight. Right now. I'd stop making excuses and just go. It's 3 in the morning. So, Mrs. Rose probably can't sleep anyway because of the pain. And Mr. Frank stays up worrying about her. They'd want to see you, no matter what time it is. What if they don't forgive me? What if they do?" David was quiet for so long that Jamal wondered if the call had dropped. Finally he spoke. "Will you come with me? I know it's a lot to ask, but I think I might need someone there who understands what they mean to each other. What they mean to you." Jamal thought about his mother, about school, about all the reasons this was a bad idea. Then he thought about Rose's trembling hands and Frank's tired eyes and the way they'd welcomed him into their lives without question. "Yes," he said. "I'll come with you. I'll pick you up in 20 minutes." As Jamal quietly got dressed, his heart hammered with nervous energy. He was about to help orchestrate a reunion 15 years in the making, between a dying woman and the son who had forgotten how to come home. He left a note for his mother, grabbed his jacket, and stepped out into the night to wait for a man he'd never met but somehow understood completely. The black sedan pulled up to Jamal's apartment building at exactly 3:20 a.m., its engine purring quietly in the pre-dawn darkness. Jamal had been waiting on the steps, his breath visible in small puffs of vapor, and when the rear door opened, he found himself face to face with David Kith. The man looked nothing like the polished executive from the newspaper photos. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his hair disheveled, and his eyes held the kind of raw vulnerability that comes from finally admitting the truth to yourself. Jamal. David's voice was uncertain. Mr. Kith. Jamal slid into the car, noting the way David's hands shook slightly as he gave the driver Rose and Frank's address. They rode in silence for the first few minutes, the city passing by in a blur of empty streets and flickering streetlights. Finally, David spoke. Tell me about them. How they really are. Jamal thought about how to capture Rose and Frank in words, their quiet dignity, their gentle humor, the way they made their small house feel like the center of the universe. They're the best people I've ever met, he said simply. Mrs. Rose makes cookies from scratch even when her hands hurt, and Mr. Frank knows the names of all the neighborhood kids. They don't have much money, but they're rich in ways that matter. Are they happy? They're happy together. But they're scared too. About the cancer, about losing their house, about... Jamal hesitated. About dying alone, David finished quietly. Yeah. David stared out the window. I used to spend every afternoon at their house when I was your age. My parents worked such long hours, and Rose would help me with homework while Frank told stories about his bus routes. They never made me feel like I was in the way. They still have pictures of you everywhere. They do. Your high school graduation, some award ceremony, even one of you as a little kid covered in flour from helping in your parents' restaurant. David's laugh was shaky. I remember that day. Rose was teaching me to make dumplings, and I got more flour on myself than in the bowl. As they turned onto Maple Avenue, David's nervousness became palpable. What if this is a mistake? What if seeing me just makes things harder for them? Mr. Kith, Jamal said, the only mistake would be not trying. The house looked smaller in the darkness, its windows glowing softly with the warm light of people who couldn't sleep. David stared at it for a long moment, and Jamal could see him gathering courage. Okay, David said finally. Let's do this. They walked up the familiar path together, past Rose's coffee can flowers, up the slightly sagging porch steps. David raised his hand to knock, then hesitated. What if? The door opened before he could finish the thought. Frank stood there in his bathrobe, his hair mussed from lying awake, and for a moment, time seemed suspended. David! Frank's voice was barely a whisper. Hello, Frank. The two men stared at each other across 15 years of silence, and Jamal held his breath. Then Frank's face crumpled, and he pulled David into a fierce embrace. My boy, Frank whispered. My boy, you came home. David's composure finally broke, and he clung to the man who had been more of a father to him than his own father ever was. I'm sorry, he said over and over. I'm so sorry. Frank! Who's at the door? Rose's voice came from inside the house, weak but curious. Frank pulled back, his eyes bright with tears. Rose, you're not going to believe this. They helped Rose to the living room, where she settled into her chair with David kneeling beside her. In the soft lamplight, Jamal could see how much the cancer had taken from her, but her eyes were bright with joy. Look at you, she said, touching David's face with trembling fingers. So handsome, so successful. We're so proud of you. Rose, David's voice broke. I got your letter. I should have called, should have come sooner. I should have been here. You're here now, Rose said simply. That's what matters. But I wasted so much time. 15 years. 15 years of you building the life we always knew you could have, Frank interrupted. We never stopped being proud of you, son. Never. David looked around the room, at the photographs that chronicled his life, at the ceramic birds Rose had collected, at the worn furniture that held decades of love. I forgot, he said quietly. I forgot what home felt like. Home isn't a place, Rose said, echoing what she'd told Jamal weeks earlier. It's the people who love you no matter what. They talked until dawn, sharing 15 years of stories in a few precious hours. David told them about his business, his success, his loneliness. Rose and Frank shared their quiet life, their small joys, their deep contentment with each other. As the sun began to rise, painting the living room in soft gold light, David made his promises. The medical bills would be taken care of. Rose would have the best doctors, the most advanced treatments. They would keep their house, their independence, their dignity. But more than that, he would be present. He would come for dinner on Sundays, help Frank with the yard work, sit with Rose during her treatments. He would be the son they had raised him to be. "There's one more thing," David said, pulling out his phone. "I want to establish a foundation. The Rose and Frank Kith Foundation for community support. To help families like ours, people who fall through the cracks." Rose's eyes filled with tears. "David, that's beautiful, but nothing. You two taught me that success means lifting others up. It's time I remembered that lesson." As Jamal watched this reunion unfold, he felt something shift inside him. He'd learned that love could survive years of silence, that bridges could be rebuilt, that sometimes the right words at the right time could change everything. What bridges in your own life might be waiting for someone brave enough to cross them first? 3 months later, Jamal stood in the same living room, but everything had changed. Rose's treatments were working. Slowly, but working. The house was filled with the sounds of renovation as David had it updated for Rose's needs. And most importantly, it was filled with laughter again. David had kept every promise. He came for Sunday dinners, brought flowers for Rose, played chess with Frank. He'd hired Jamal as a part-time assistant for the foundation, teaching him about business while learning from him about community. "You know," Rose said to Jamal as they watched David and Frank argue good-naturedly over a chess move, "I think that lunch you shared with us was the best investment any of us ever made." Jamal smiled, thinking about how one small act of kindness had rippled outward, touching lives in ways he never could have imagined. "My grandmother always said kindness multiplies." "She was a wise woman," Rose said, squeezing his hand. "Just like her grandson." Outside, the first snow of winter was beginning to fall, but inside the small blue house on Maple Avenue, 3 generations sat together in the warmth of love rediscovered, proving that sometimes the most extraordinary transformations begin with the simplest acts of human kindness. How might your own small acts of kindness be creating ripples you can't yet see? Share with us in the comments below. We would love to read your story. Thank you for listening to this amazing story of Jamal's act of kindness. Make sure you subscribe for more.